Well, welcome to 10-Minute Record Reviews, episode 412, and this is a special episode. It's a report on my trip to New York. Now, as many of you know, I was in New York last week. This was fundamentally and primarily a dad and daughter trip, long delayed by COVID. Eventually, we got to do it. This was my daughter's first trip to New York, so of course we were making a priority of the kinds of things which she wanted to do. So we saw some Broadway shows, we saw some comedy, we went to Central Park, we ate real pizza, i.e. New York pizza, a lot. We went on a mafia tour of Little Italy, and we had a great night in Harlem at the Apollo Theater watching Amateur Night and eating ribs at Sylvia's. We went to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and we also went to Lincoln Center, although we didn't get to see a show there, which is too bad. Now, usually, with opera, you've got to sit through 3 hours of grunting in Italian or German before you get to the hit single, but this time they were producing an opera which apparently was an extended drum solo. As a Zeppelin fan, I was very excited, but unfortunately we couldn't get tickets. So as I say, principally we were checking off bucket list items for my daughter, but she's a kind girl, she's well brought up, and she knows her dad well, and so she made sure that we had some time for a few jazz-related things on the itinerary. Those things included record shopping, and they also included going to jazz gigs, which is fantastic, because New York, I think, is still the best city in the world to see live jazz, and arguably, well, certainly in the conversation, as the best city in the world to shop for jazz records. Now, I'll get to the records in just a second, because I know that's why people are tuning in, but I'll just mention briefly the jazz gigs we saw. We flew on Sunday the 16th, and my original plan had been for us to go to the Village Vanguard when we got in that night. We had enough time. Joe Lovano was playing with his trio Tapestry group from that record, and that's Marilyn Crispell on piano and Carmen Castaldi on percussion. However, the weather and Alaska Airlines had other ideas, so we missed that gig. Fortunately, we still had a free evening on the Thursday. I was keen to go to the Vanguard, and there was another show I wanted to go see, so we got tickets. The Vanguard is fantastic. It is really the OG club in New York. Minton's, of course, has been there for a long time, but it was shut for many, many decades before reinventing itself a few years ago. Birdland is still there, but it's on its third or fourth, I think third location, so it's not quite what it was. But the Vanguard is still pretty much as it was. There's a new awning, but otherwise it doesn't really give much evidence of having been updated at all, which is to its credit, I think. And the Vanguard is the place where I think probably most classic live jazz recordings have been made, more than any other club. Maybe the Lighthouse in Hermosa Beach, which of course has equivalent bragging rights on the West Coast, might be a competitor in those sweepstakes, but there have been a lot of great live records made at the Vanguard. Joe Lovano's trio wasn't playing that night, but he was in a septet with Jakob Bro, who totally coincidentally I'd seen at the Vanguard 5 years before when I was in New York. They had 2 drummers with them and 3 bass players. It was the group from the ECM record Once Around the Room, which is a tribute of sorts to Paul Motian. Paul Motian, of course, the late drummer who made some amazing records at the Vanguard, so it was a really fitting setting. Other than my daughter, the crowd at the club was largely men who looked just like me, strangely enough, somewhat representative of the demographics of this channel. The gig was great, but parts of it were seriously out jazz, and at one point my daughter leaned over to me and said, "Are they playing an actual song?" Well, how many layers of the onion do you peel back when answering a question like that? Anyway, it was an event. I thought it was a great gig. We met some nice folks there as well. The other gig we went to was the next night, last Friday night, at the Blue Note, and we went to see Esperanza Spalding. Now, the Blue Note is not a place you go to stretch out and enjoy jazz in spacious surroundings. They really pack you in, and it was packed that night. And she was fantastic. If you're going to call her any particular genre of musician, I guess you'd call her a jazz musician. But that kind of does her a disservice because she moves very easily through R&B, pop, poetry. It's almost performance art in a certain way. She's a wonderful singer, she's a wonderful bassist, she's a wonderful composer. And what she does is hold the attention of the room like a magnet for the duration of the gig. So if you do get a chance to go and see Esperanza Spalding, I totally recommend it. Now, on with the record shopping part of this video. So I'd like to thank everybody who commented on the earlier video with their suggestions. And in that video, I made a list of 9 stores, which, based on my own experience and based on some creative Googling, seemed like the places to go in New York for used jazz vinyl. That's what I look for. And the list that I originally came up with included 4 stores in Manhattan, and they were the Jazz Record Center, A1 Records in the East Village, Academy Records in the Flatiron District, and Stranded Records on East 5th. In that first video, I also identified 5 record stores in Brooklyn, and those were Academy Records Annex in Greenpoint, and also in Greenpoint, Captured Records. In Williamsburg, I identified Human Head Records and Superior Elevation, and down in Flatbush, Record City. Now, I ended up altering this list based largely on the feedback I got in that video, but also partly on just the logistics of doing this in a relatively short period of time. For the Manhattan portion, I dropped stranded records from the list, and I also learned from a few people that I'd identified the wrong Academy records. I shouldn't go to the one on 18th, I ought to go to the one on 12th. In Brooklyn, I ended up dropping Record City from the list because it required one specific trip to go to one store down in Flatbush, whereas the other stores I was going to were all effectively within walking distance of each other. However, I did add 2 stores to the Brooklyn itinerary. The first of those was Billy's Record Salon, which lots of people said absolutely was a place I had to go, and also Blue Sun, which is a small store, but it had the advantage of being quite near the other record stores in Williamsburg. So that still ended up leaving me with a list of 9 stores, 3 of them in Manhattan, which were all pretty much consensus picks, and in Brooklyn, 6 stores, which were all fairly easily reachable on foot. And I just want to stress again, the record stores that I didn't get to, which some people had mentioned to me, Stranded Records, Record City, Ergo Records. I mean, no disrespect to those stores. They may be very fine stores. I just wasn't able to fit them in. But they also weren't stores that people were saying, you're crazy if you don't go there. I chose the stores I did because I have limited time and I find there's value in crowdsourcing these things. And without blowing my own horn, well, too much anyway, I have been fortunate in recent years to be able to do fairly extensive record shopping in New York, London, Tokyo, LA, Seattle, Mexico City, Havana, Toronto, Ottawa, Winnipeg, Montreal, and Vancouver, as well as little sojourns in Ecuador and Vietnam. So at a certain point, you trust your own instincts and go with your gut. Now, just before I start my description of this, I think it's also important to know how I conduct myself and what I look for when I go to a record store. My own collection these days is in total about 2,300 records. The great majority of that is jazz. And when it comes to well-known artists, for the most part, my days of collecting the big names are over. I've got over 30 Miles Davis records. I've got similar for Coltrane. I've got lots of Cannonball, Bill Evans, Sonny Rollins, Pharoah Sanders, Shelly Manne, Ahmad Jamal, Archie Shepp, Mingus, Jazz Messengers, Brubeck, Chet Baker, you name it. Okay, so I've got pretty much what I want of those particular artists. There is occasionally a record that I do want by one of them, and I'm not typically going to rely on finding it in a record store bin. I'm probably going to find a strategy to source it online somehow. And frankly, if you do go to a record store and you do look in the crates under the big names, what you're going to find basically is recent reissues, 180 gram extravaganza, whatevers. If there are any really great early pressings of the great artists, they're going to be up on the wall and they're going to be 100, 200, 300 bucks, that kind of thing. So it's not really what I do. What I do is look through the jazz miscellaneous categories. So jazz A, jazz F to H, that kind of thing. That's where you're going to find the good but lesser known stuff is, and that's where you're going to find originals. You'll find a lot of stuff by artists that you don't know, but on labels that you probably do. And if you know enough about those labels, it's often worth rolling the dice. Anyway, that's my strategy, and so on to talk about the stores, and I'll talk about my experience at each of them, and at the end I'll give you some recommendations to hopefully make your record buying trip to New York as efficient as possible. So we were in New York for a week, and on 3 different days, for portions of those days, I did some record shopping. The first day that I had time to look for records, I went to one of the most legendary stores on the planet, certainly for used jazz records, the Jazz Record Center. This is the store, of course, run by Fred Cohen, who wrote the definitive volume on the details regarding collecting early Blue Note pressings. Here I am with Fred. I'm looking a tad pink here as I never got around to taking my coat off, and it was very warm in the store. He is a lovely guy. The Jazz Record Center is on West 26th, and it's actually up on the 8th floor. So once you know that, it's relatively straightforward to get to. There's no sign. Well, I guess there is a little sign, but you basically have to buzz in like you're going up to a lawyer's office. Here I am walking along 26th up to the street level door, and I ended up following this guy in without buzzing. I took the elevator to the 8th floor, and then there's a nondescript door which you open. I know some people have had trouble, but I didn't. Once I was in, I chatted with Fred. I thanked him very much for his book and for what he had contributed to the vinyl collector's universe. And he then asked me what I was looking for, and we were chatting, and he said, you're not going to find any original Blue Notes in there, not these days. And I said, well, that's okay, because I'm not looking for any. And he goes, good. So anyway, in I went. I didn't take many pictures in here, because if I had done, they'd all kind of look like this. It's not exactly a very dramatic looking store. It looks rather like a file room in a lawyer's office, like I say, but they're basically aisles and aisles and aisles of used jazz records. Quite an extensive selection, which is great, and I did buy a few records there. I will, however, confess that I was a little bit underwhelmed by the Jazz Record Center. I do understand they have a fairly robust online trade, and maybe that's the reason, and maybe that's a good thing, because the physical store just had that feeling, you know, if you're in a store and you feel it's been picked over a little bit, it was kind of that feeling. You had to dig pretty hard. Now, I did buy some records because there is enough of an inventory there that you're certainly going to find something that you're interested in. It's unlikely you won't find something that you want, but I did feel like the great majority of the records in the place weren't necessarily of the sort to increase your pulse. This, of course, can happen to any store that hasn't had a recent injection of new inventory, but I found in my other conversations with people it wasn't too hard to find people who'd had similar experiences at the JRC. All that said, it's still a place and an owner worthy of great respect, and I also kind of wonder whether my own experience was not skewed by perhaps having unreasonable expectations going in. In any event, here's what I did find. I found 5 records. The first one I found is this record by Jimmy Cleveland. Now, you may not know the name Jimmy Cleveland, but he was a darn fine jazz trombonist, and I find that almost anything he did on the MRC or the Mercury labels, which again were kind of the same thing, is worth picking up, and this is no exception. What I'll do here, as you can see, is put down here the year of the pressing, whether it was a reissue, whether it was first pressing or not, and the grading I've given the vinyl, and the price I paid, just for your reference. Anyway, this was a sweet pickup, and it's in great shape, both inside and outside, so quite happy about that. The next record I got is a bit quirky. It is something putatively by the Jazz Workshop. This is actually a vehicle for Al Cohn, who is one of my favorite Lester Young acolyte tenor saxophonists, and he has the support of 4 trumpeters on here, including Bernie Glow, Nick Travis, Freddie Green, and Joe Newman, and Ozzie Johnson and Buddy Jones are the rhythm section. This is a really nice record. By the way, I just meant to mention, maybe it's a New York thing, or maybe it's an everywhere else but where I live thing, but there seems to be a habit of sticking stickers, price stickers, right onto the front cover of records in New York. Maybe that's because thievery is rampant there. Who knows? But in any event, it's something I can deal with, but I know for some of you more OCD types out there, that's going to be a struggle. Well, if you go to New York, be prepared to struggle, because they're sticking those stickers right on the cover. The next record I found was by an artist that I'm actually increasingly keen on. He's a piano player out of Chicago, a guy called Lou Levy. I first got to know his work because he did a lot of West Coast work later on. This is a record called A Most Musical Fella. There's a 1950s title, if ever there was one, on RCA Victor. This is one of his piano trio records. Very nice touch. He is a very sympathetic and kind of organic player in a trio. He leaves lots of space for others. That's probably why he was such a good accompanist later in his career for people like Ella. Anyway, this is a very nice piano trio record, and you would not ever regret picking this one up. I certainly didn't. I've really enjoyed listening to it so far. The second last record I'm going to talk about from the Jazz Record Center is this one with a beautiful glossy cover. It's a Savoy release. It is a reissue from the 1970s. Now, Savoy, if you collect them, you know that one of the ways to tell the date of a Savoy record is by the color of the label. This is, I'll show you what I mean. This is an oxblood, as it's called, color label. You can see the record's actually in absolutely lovely condition. This is a 1970s repress, and it sounds fantastic. And it's actually, I suspect, I haven't really researched this, but I suspect it's a redo of a couple of 10 inches, because it's got a quintet on side 1, which has Horace Silver on piano and Curly Russell on bass. So 2 of the original jazz messengers are there. And on the second side, Al Cohn is joined by the great bebop and bop pioneer on piano, George Wallington. Music is as good as you might expect with those people on it. So really nice pickup. And as I say, lovely and glossy inside and out. The last record I'm going to talk about from the Jazz Record Center is this one, which includes a rather unusual misprint. I don't know how you pluralize the word sax, but I don't think it's sax with an XS. Anyway, that's what you've got here. It's spelt differently, just without the S on all other pressings. This is by Herb Geller, and it's a lovely record. It's got Victor Feldman on vibes. It's also got Leroy Vinegar on bass, and that usually is a sign that the record is going to swing hard, and it absolutely does. So that was a great pickup. So again, I had to dig kind of hard at the Jazz Record Center, but I did find some things that I'm very happy to have brought home. So I did that on one particular day. The next time I had some time to go record shopping was on a different day, and we found ourselves in the East Village after we'd done our Mafia tour. First, I went to A1 Records. Now, A1 Records has a pretty decent inventory and a respectable number of interesting records in the stacks, particularly in jazz. Here you can get a bit of a sense of the jazz area. It's not a specialty jazz place, but it does have a strong jazz section, and I'm glad I went to A1. And I bought 3 records there, including one record I've been looking for ages, plus a quirky and somewhat unusual Riverside. The first one I'll talk about is neither of those. It is actually my attempt at what a friend of mine calls up-minting, which is finding a better version of a record you already have. I have the stereo version of this. This is Zoot Sims' The Art of Jazz, which itself is a repress. The original came out on Dawn Records a few years before. This is a 1960-ish, I think. What is it? Yeah, 1960 mono reissue on Seco, which is actually better known for Latin pressings. I bought this. I got it for $8. I bought it because I have a stereo version, which I don't really care for in terms of the sound. Well, this was not necessarily that much better. It's a bit better, so I think I'm probably going to end up getting rid of this one and eventually looking for the original on Dawn. But the music is good, so maybe I'll sit with this for a while. The next record is one I've been looking for a while. I have done a label guide of Bethlehem records, as some of you will know, and one of the records I've looked for ages and ages, and I kind of actually put off doing the label guide hoping I'd find it, and I hadn't, is this one by Charlie Mariano, the alto sax player. This is an absolute gem. It is one of the great early Bethlehem releases in my view. It's also quite hard to find, obviously. I got this really quite well-preserved record for what I think was a very competitive price, so I was really chuffed, I will say, to have this one, and I've only spun it once briefly, but I'm looking forward to settling in with a couple fingers of single malt and really absorbing this one when I get the chance. The last record I got at A1 is this one, which I'd never actually seen before. It's one of those ones where, I'm busy Googling while I'm in the store, but it's interesting. It is actually, it's not really a Riverside, it's a Jazzland, which of course was their budget reissue in print. But usually the Jazzlands don't sound too bad. It's something called Bombastica by the Werner Rosengren Swedish Jazz Quartet. Who? Well, exactly. The liner notes make it pretty clear that this is not your standard Riverside/Jazzland blowing session. It is in fact a bunch of original compositions by Swedish composers, including Lasse Werner. He's referred to, I guess in an attempt to make this more accessible for an American audience, Lars Werner, but his name is actually Lasse Werner. He's on piano, and he is definitely the star of the group. Incidentally, he barely records again after making this record for about a decade, but he's quite active again in the 1970s. As for the music, it's really interesting. It's full of polyrhythms. They usually work in kind of a fascinating way. It's a very ambitious and what you might call painterly kind of record, but sometimes I think they kind of overstretch and the polyrhythms just sound a little bit, I guess, uncoordinated. But for the most part, it's a pretty interesting and gripping listen, so I'm really happy to have picked this up. The other place I went to in the East Village that day was Academy Records. Now, originally, you'll recall that in the first video, I was like, I'm going to go to Academy on 18th, and then people wrote in and said, no, go to Academy on 12th. Now, they were right. I went to the Academy on 12th, and I was actually quite impressed with it. As you can see, it's not really an enormous jazz selection, but it's really quite respectable, although I did end up, just for happenstance reasons, only getting one record there, and it's this one. It's a record I didn't really know a heck of a lot about. This is an original Blue Note, first pressing from 1968. It's a wonderful record. It's hard bop. It's got, as some might say, kind of a swinging 60s feel to it as well. And it has superb soloing from Foster on sax, which you would expect, I think, if you know anything about him. It's also a Rudy Van Gelder Soup to Nuts product, being a Liberty pressing on Blue Note from 1968. As I say, it's not a record I knew much about or even knew of, I think, before I walked into the store, but it was, again, a Blue Note from 68. I knew Foster was a good musician, so I took a chance, and I think this was one of the real finds of the whole trip. So those are the record stores I went to in Manhattan, but my big record shopping day in New York was actually just this last Friday in Brooklyn. My daughter had her own thing she wanted to do. She wanted to go to Fifth Avenue. Ching! So I said, well, you know, do you mind if I spend a few hours over in Brooklyn? And she said no, so off I went. And again, I'll reiterate that the advantage of particular stores that I'm going to mention is that they can all be visited on foot, walking from one to the other in a few hours, and that includes the time you spend digging through the stacks. I say walk, I did cheat and take a short one-stop trip on the subway from Greenpoint to Williamsburg, but only because I was cold. I started in Greenpoint at Academy Records Annex, which a number of viewers had recommended, and I have to say it was fantastic. I purchased no fewer than 9 records here, the great majority of which I would say are really nice under-the-radar specials. It was one of those stores and one of those visits where you end up putting back a lot of records because you suddenly look at what you've got and you think this is objectively nuts. So I was getting carried away, but I still ended up buying 9 records there. The first of these is a first pressing on Riverside by a guy called Trigger Alpert. It's the sole record he ever made as a leader. He's a bassist, a perennial sideman in the swing era and then going through into the modern jazz era. And there are some wonderful names on here as well. Marty Paich, whom you'll know is usually a mark of quality. Zoot Sims and Al Cohn, those wonderful saxophonists. The ever-suggestive Dick Hyman, and so on. It's one of those records that kind of straddles the boundary between swing and modern. But again, anything with Marty Paich and his arranging sensibilities tends to take a larger group of musicians, this is a septet, I believe, or an octet septet, and turn it into something more intimate sounding, and that's exactly the effect you get here. So very happy to have picked this up. The next record I got is by somebody I've already mentioned, George Wallington, who was one of the original piano stars of the, I guess, of the hard bop era. Also in the Mafia theme, I think a Sicilian, if I recall, and he adopted the name Wallington for, well, I guess other reasons. This is some of the later work he did on Atlantic. This has got Teddy Kotick on bass and Nick Stabulus on drums. Otherwise, it's a piano trio record. Really enjoyable. Very happy to find this, and also very happy at the glossiness of the laminated cover. So I was tickled by that. I was also tickled by this record. Now, this is a Riverside record that I'd never really given much thought to and I'd never seen in the wild ever. I actually saw 3 copies of this, 1 mono, 2 stereo. I ended up buying the stereo. I saw the mono later, but by then it was too late. 3 copies of this on the same day in Brooklyn. It is by Evans Bradshaw, the Evans Bradshaw Trio, Pieces of 88. Evans Bradshaw is one of the great mystery men of mid-century jazz. He makes 2 records as a leader for Riverside and then vaporizes. And can you find anything about him on the internet? You cannot. So who knows? If you know enough about what happens to jazz guys, you can have your suspicions, but I have no idea if that's the case or not. It's an interesting record. I haven't really come to a landed opinion on it because I've only had a chance to listen to it in snatches so far, but very happy to have found this one. Next record I found was another old Atlantic with a shiny, glossy, laminated cover, which drew my attention like a shiny object. Mood Jazz by Joe Castro with voices and strings. It is pretty much what it says on the tin. It's got some nice piano playing. It's got some vocalese. I will say it's a little bit schmaltzy, but it's also kind of fun for all that. Think of it as kind of, well, you know, aiming where Donald Byrd got with some of his records with voices, but falling a bit short. But still, kind of fun, and it was a nice price, so it was a nice pickup. I also found a record I've been looking for a while, thought about buying now and then hadn't, but I always wanted to because it was Eric Dolphy's, effectively his debut on record, and it's this one by Chico Hamilton. Now, Chico Hamilton, of course, was part of those original great small combos out of the West Coast. This one is made with strings. Now, typically I avoid these with strings kinds of records because they were attempts by record labels to somehow bridge the divide between, you know, good jazz and people who like to listen to easy listening music. And so they thought, put a lush string section in there and, you know, Bob's your uncle. Didn't always work. And I won't say this record always works, but it is fascinating to hear Dolphy's contributions in what is kind of a record trying to be multiple things to multiple people, not quite necessarily pulling it all off. Best summarized, I think, as a quirky piece of chamber jazz, and again, Eric Dolphy's debut on record, unless you count the obscure rock and roll single he made the year before. Now, the next record I got is a little unusual. It's not an early original pressing. It's one of these kind of low-budget reissues of old material, but not really ever released before, I think. This is by Art Pepper, with Sonny Clark's trio. It is a live, I think an audience recording, or at least a not very good professional recording, made at the Lighthouse in Hermosa Beach in 1953. So it's got Art Pepper on alto, Sonny Clark on piano, Harry Babison, about whom I've talked on the channel recently, on bass, and Bobby White on drums. It's got some very good performances. As I say, the sound quality is not that great, but once you kind of acclimatize to that, it's a fun listen. So listen to it for a while, may hang on to it, may not. The next record I got at Academy Annex in Brooklyn was something I was quite pleased to find, and this was this record which came out on ABC Paramount by Jimmy Rainey. He was a lovely jazz guitarist, and he's also playing with three artists, all of whom I think are underappreciated, and those are the valve trombonist Bob Brookmeyer, the tenor saxophonist Al Cohn, whom I've talked about earlier in this video, and a bass player who's one of my favorites, Red Mitchell. This had the advantage of being a reasonable price and also immaculate, certainly in terms of the vinyl, and reasonably immaculate, semi-immaculate, who knows, on the outside. Something else I was happy to pick up. The second last record I'm going to talk about from Academy Annex is this one, which is by Red Mitchell, funnily enough, speaking of him, which I got for $5. This is Red Mitchell on cello. It's a live recording at the Renaissance in LA, and he's with really a spectacular band. He's with Jim Hall on guitar, Frank Strazzeri on piano, who would go on to cut records in the 70s, which are now incredibly recherché by DJs, Jimmy Bond on bass, and the wonderful Frank Butler on drums. If you're familiar with the Curtis Counts Group's debut, which is sometimes called Landslide, there is a track, the very last track on that record is called A Fifth for Frank, which contains, I think, the greatest drum solo of any variety that I've ever heard. It's also beautifully recorded. There is a drum solo, not quite as good, but certainly very interesting, by Butler on this record as well. As for Mitchell's pizzicato cello playing, I wouldn't put it in the same caliber, I think, as Harry Babison's or even Oscar Pettiford's, but it's certainly a very interesting record, and there are some hard-swinging episodes on here. So for $5, I really enjoyed it. I think the reason it was $5 is, and here's something for you kids out there. Here is the reason I think it was $5. If you can see, there is a mark on the record, but it is one of those marks probably made by a fingernail, which you cannot feel with a fingernail and does not, as I say, affect play, DNAP. So otherwise, this record is effectively mint. It is absolutely silent, and to pick this up for $5 was a treat. The last record I got at Academy Annex was the first of 3 Randy Weston records I picked up on that day. It is this one, Little Niles, by Randy Weston's Music, which was how he was styling his group at a particular point. Weston, of course, was a lifelong resident of Brooklyn. He mentored a lot of artists there as well, so it's probably not surprising that you can find quite a few Randy Weston records in Brooklyn. This one is made with a bigger band. I've got some trio records of his as well today. It's ambitious, but it really delivers, and it is a record which has, well, I can already tell, will have layers and layers and layers on repeated listening. Academy Annex is in the Greenpoint area of Brooklyn, as is the next store I went to, Captured Records, which was also on the way to the subway, so it was an obvious stop. Anyway, I actually really enjoyed going to Captured Records. It was something I was debating about doing because I knew it wasn't the biggest. It's not the most amazing place for jazz, but it's not a place you're going to regret going to by any stretch. I did end up paying way too much money for some Japanese food just nearby, but that's a different issue. I did, however, get pretty good deals on 2 records at Captured. The first of those was this one. Now, this is a Bethlehem release. It's one of these twofers which Bethlehem released in the mid to late 50s, basically reissuing music which they had put out on 10-inch records in 1954, thereabouts. So this is one which has Eddie Shue's group on side A and Bob Hardaway's group on side B. I would say the Eddie Shue side is a little bit stronger, but it's a very pleasing record overall, and it is lovely to find an original Bethlehem in great shape for that kind of money. So that was a fun find. And the other record which I found at Captured was equally pleasing. It's this one. It's a live record by the Jazz Tet. It's made at the Chicago club, Birdhouse. The Jazz Tet, of course, was a project of Art Farmer and Benny Golson. You can see them there on the front cover. Included lots of great people at different points, like Curtis Fuller on trombone and McCoy Tyner on piano. This particular lineup has Cedar Walton on piano, Tootie Heath on drums, and others. They can basically do no wrong, these guys, in that 2 or 3 year run they had, and this is a great example of that. And I think it's the only live record they made, although I'll have to check that out. So that was Captured Records. Having finished in Greenpoint, I then took a short subway record down to Williamsburg, although as I mentioned, had it been warmer I would have walked and could easily have walked. The first place I went to was Blue Sun Records, and that had been recommended by a viewer. I'm happy enough to have gone there, although as you can see, it's not the biggest record store and the jazz selection is not particularly extensive. Fair enough, I knew that going in, and I went there because it was within easy reach of other record stores I was going to in Williamsburg. Here I am with the owner, who's called Billy, not to be confused with the owner of Billy's Record Salon that I'm going to talk about shortly, but I do need to point out that this Billy, it's very clear that he was the first Billy to sell used records in Brooklyn. Anyway, he's a very nice guy, and I did buy a couple of records there, including the only non-jazz record I got on this trip, which is an '86 compilation of music by those ska lords, the Scatolites. This is actually a lovely compilation by Studio One. Has that classically rough-looking, you can see, rough-looking Studio One label, which is a mark of quality, I will say. And the other record I got is a jazz record. Now, this is by the Ramsey Lewis Trio. I talked about Ramsey Lewis when I was doing a discussion of Argo records. Ramsey Lewis put out a lot of records in the 50s and particularly the 60s. In the 60s they were a bit formulaic and you have to pick and choose, but his 50s product is pretty good, and this is one of them. This is his Ramsey Lewis and the Gentlemen of Jazz. It says Volume 2, but it's not really a Volume 1. This is just one of his 1950s records. Very enjoyable record and really quite ambitious in terms of the scope of the compositions they tackle here. So well recommended, in great shape, and really quite a nice price as well. I then made my way down Grand Street in Brooklyn to Superior Elevation, which I had previously visited about 7 or 8 years ago when they were in a different location in a basement in kind of an industrial building. And I guess the basement location was a bit of a vulnerability because what I gathered in my visit here was that they had suffered a major flood and had lots of damage to the existing stock at the time. So they've since relocated to this nice storefront, an above ground location on a much more commercially appealing street in Brooklyn. This is a really good store. I remember thinking that at the time when I was there before. I think they've gotten even better. They certainly have a very strong jazz section, which I didn't really recall the last time. And although I only bought 2 records, it's kind of because my arms at that point were getting tired and I was thinking a little bit about my bank balance as well. I ended up getting 2 terrific records at Superior Elevation. And this is the first of these. I was absolutely thrilled to get this. Now, I have been trying to gather lots and lots and lots of Impulse records over the years, not to the extent of a friend of mine who is an Impulse completist, but this is a record I've looked for ages, and I've never really found it for something approaching a reasonable price. But this is an immaculate, near mint, first stereo pressing for $40. I absolutely could not say no. The lineup on here, again, you can see for yourselves, but it's got Freddie Hubbard and Jimmy Merritt, Cedar Walton, Jimmy Heath, and so on, Jimmy Cobb. It is, for all intents and purposes, as good sounding and as well produced and as well engineered a record as any Blue Note record from the same era. It has that sound. It's effectively on par with Blue Note records for which you would pay $600, $700, $1,000 for first pressings in equivalent condition. So I was just thrilled by this. This is a great addition to my collection. It's never leaving my collection. And what can I say? I'm tickled. The other record I found, not quite hitting those same heights, but still very nice record, is an early Atlantic by Lee Konitz, Inside Hi-Fi. It's another great one. It's an intriguing release by Lee Konitz. He had this light lilting tone, but he was always more experimental and unpredictable than his peers on the alto sax. Very enjoyable, and I think for what it is, very reasonably priced. So now it was time for me to go to a record store I'd not been to before, but had been highly recommended, Billy's Record Salon, and I was looking forward to this quite a lot. Again, a number of viewers had said, boy, you really got to go there. This is the place. You know, I thought, okay, well, maybe, we'll see. So I found my way there. As you will see, amusingly, it was a former hair salon, or so I imagine, and it looks like Billy has kept the original signage. It's got only the faintest markings indicating that it's a record store on the door, but of course a quick look inside and seeing the demographics will dispel any misapprehensions you have. As you can see, it's not the largest store in the world, and I wondered a little bit if all the hype had been worth it, but I'm happy to say that it absolutely lived up to the hype, because this store was the definition of all killer, no filler. In fact, I would say the only real limitation of Billy's Record Salon, if you're buying used jazz vinyl, is that it doesn't necessarily have the size of inventory of Academy Annex, for instance. I ended up getting 4 records, and I will say I put 4 or 5 back before I bought those 4 records, largely for reasons of frugality and fatigue, which I mentioned earlier. The first record I'll mention is another Randy Weston record. I mentioned that I'd got a few. This is a very early one of his on Riverside, and it's actually a very early Riverside. You'll see that it is a deep groove. Well, you can't quite see the deep groove, I think, because of the plastic. I have the plastic on it because the cover is not in great shape. But it's a very early white label Riverside. In fact, it's my first white label Riverside that I've ever had. And frankly, for a $10 record, it's in pretty good shape. I have to say, I was quite pleased with it. I was prepared for anything with that price, but it is very, very listenable. It's a lovely piano trio record, and as I say, I think it's his second for Riverside. The next record I got at Billy's Record Salon is this one by Coleman Hawkins, Soul. Now, Coleman Hawkins was a veteran of the swing era. I think he played with Fletcher Henderson. I'll have to check that. In any event, he is a veteran of the swing era, but he navigated the shift through bebop into modern jazz far better than a lot of his peers who had made their names in the swing era before. This is one of his small group efforts, and it's really quite tasty, with the caveat that Rudy Van Gelder, who is the recording engineer on here and is usually fairly reliable, even if we all know what he does to a piano, he was doing something a bit wacky with the recording of Hawkins' sax, particularly on track A1, which sounds very bright, unusually bright. But it doesn't really persist through the whole record. And I will say, too, this record also has, I mean, the lineup is amazing. Kenny Burrell's on guitar and Ray Bryant on piano and others. But Burrell and Bryant are both excellent here. And Burrell, I would say, is almost the star of the record, frankly. So this was a lovely pickup, first pressing, and just really enjoyable. But not as enjoyable as the next record I found, which was one of my 2 real highlights of the trip. Well, I guess 3 if you include the Curtis Fuller. And that is coming across this record. Conti Candoli Quartet in lovely condition. It's a 1957 Mode first pressing, mono first pressing. I'm a huge fan of Mode records and of the releases they put out, all in 1957, all within a few months. This one, of course, like all those, or most of those, has the lovely portrait cover painted by Eva Diana. And it really is one of the gems of that particular run of records. I've looked for this for years and years, found it now and then for rather ridiculous prices. This was a very reasonable price. You'll notice too that Billy's Record Salon does not put stickers on the covers, which is another reason to appreciate Billy, I guess. Anyway, this was a real find, a real gem. I practically clicked my heels when I saw this. It was, I think, in the recently arrived section. Anyway, I picked it up and it wasn't leaving my hot little hands until I got out of the store. So I'm really quite happy with this one. And I'm also super happy with the very next record as well, which is this one by the John Wright Trio. Now, John Wright recorded, I think, a couple, maybe more, but I think at least a couple of records for Prestige. I talked about one on the channel a few months ago called Southside Soul. This is recorded just a month or 2 later. It is frankly pretty much just as good. It is wonderful, soulful, bluesy jazz piano trio work. It is a release on Status. Now you'll see that Prestige Records cleverly sort of stuck this Status sticker over top. Status was their, again, budget reissue label. You can see there is the orange, rather sort of no muss, no fuss, generic looking label they've used. Status records can sometimes not be of the best sound quality, but Billy, the owner, and here's a picture of he and I together at the store. We had a nice chat. He assured me that this one actually was one of the exceptions and had excellent sound quality, and happy to say he was absolutely right. It was, in fact, the most expensive record I bought on this trip, but if you try and find this record on the free market, you're going to see that this is actually quite a deal, and I don't regret it at all. Now, my last stop in Brooklyn and in New York overall was Human Head Records, which is in a location which looks a bit edgy to a hayseed like me, but is actually just fine. I've been lucky enough to stumble across Human Head Records a year ago when my wife and I had a layover in Brooklyn at JFK for about 8 hours, and we went in and had a meal, and I did a little bit of record shopping. And I found that record store kind of just by chance. It was the only one I went to, and it was fantastic. I ended up getting a classic Bud Powell record, I think on Norgran, and thinking to myself, I should come back here. Well, luckily I had the chance. At this point in the day when I got there, I was actually carrying a lot of records and was feeling a little bit tired. So I was prepared to buy nothing and just have a quick look. But again, the stock changed my mind. So I did end up buying 3 records at Human Head. As you can see from this picture, or maybe you can't, but anyway, you can take my word for it, this whole aisle has a nice selection of used jazz, a lot of classic titles in here. And here I am with one of the owners, Travis, who's a fine fellow. As I say, I found 3 very desirable records. The first of these is by the Chris Anderson Trio from 1962. Again, it's a Jazzland reissue, so this is effectively a Riverside on their budget reissue label. This is called Inverted Image. It was not a record I was particularly familiar with. I'm very, very glad that I got it. The supporting lineup for Anderson, who was kind of an unfortunate guy. He was blind, he had brittle bones, so he was prevented from touring or playing a lot, and he really did not make a lot of other music after this. But the supporting lineup is probably better known than him. Bill Lee, Spike Lee's dad, on bass, and then either Philly Joe Jones or Walter Perkins on drums. It's made in 1961. The record swings. Anderson's playing is very inventive. It's not like anything you've particularly heard, so I would definitely recommend giving this record a sniff or a try if you find the opportunity. The next record I got at Human Head was another one I'd been looking for a while, and that is this one, the Vice Prez. It's by Paul Quinichette, who was so called because he sounded so much like Lester Young, who of course was known as Prez. And this is a record which Emersy put out, which is effectively a compilation of a bunch of sides which Quinichette made in the winter of 51-52, which were all previously released on Emersy's 7-inch EPs, which were a thing at one point. It's very much a record with one foot in the 4-on-the-floor swing era and one foot in the modern jazz era. It's also a hi-fi recording, must say high fidelity on here somewhere, but it's very early hi-fi. It's very much almost a wartime sound. I guess it's what you might call a pre-Rudy Van Gelder record. It has that sound where the full dynamics and the punch and the spaciousness, which were soon realized in jazz recordings by the mid-1950s, weren't really happening in 1951-52. But all that said, Quinichette is a great player, and this is a charming record. And the very last record that I bought on this trip is the third of the 3 Randy Westons I found, and it's this one. It's Randy Weston with his trio, plus the baritone sax player Cecil Payne, called With These Hands, which is a 1956 record. It's a very good date. It's another early date for Weston, who was such a giant figure in the history of Brooklyn jazz, and it contains, incidentally, the very first recording of what was, I suppose, arguably his signature piece, Little Niles, which was named for his son. Lovely record, and very happy to have picked this up as well. So for the benefit of those who want to go record shopping in New York, here's how I'd summarize my experience. First of all, as a blanket statement, all the stores that I've mentioned in this video were worth going to. There's not a single dud. And I thank viewers for steering me in the right direction, because New York is big and my time there was limited. But I still had parts of 3 different days to go record shopping, and not everybody is even going to have that. So the first choice you have is, well, do I go to Brooklyn and Manhattan, or do I just go to one or the other? Do I have time to do that? Because if you're going to go to Brooklyn and Manhattan to shop for records, you probably need 2 separate days to do it. It'd be hard to do it. It'd be a long day to do all of that in one day. Again, if you have time, there's no reason not to go to all of these. It's quite easily done. But if you don't have the time, then the first decision I would recommend is pick Brooklyn over Manhattan. In Brooklyn, you can find 5 or 6 excellent record stores, all within easy walking distance of each other, and you can visit all of them and dig through their crates in about 3 or 4 hours tops. Now, I'm not trying to slam Manhattan. It's not that the record stores there are bad. Some of them are quite good, but there just aren't as many good stores clustered in one place as in Brooklyn. So now, second decision. Let's imagine that you've decided to go to Brooklyn, but you don't have 3 or 4 hours. You've maybe got a couple hours, something like that. What should you prioritize in Brooklyn? If you're limited for time, the 2 places that I would prioritize in Brooklyn in order would be Billy's, for the sheer pound for pound quality of what was in the crates there. Again, not the biggest store, but just the sheer quality of the inventory for sale, and equal Academy Annex for a combination of the quality but also the sheer volume of what they had on offer. And those 2 stores, I would say, are closely followed by Human Head and Superior Elevation. And if for reasons of timing or convenience, you could only go to Human Head or to Superior Elevation, you'd be going to 2 very fine record stores with great jazz inventories, and you'd have few regrets. So those are my recommendations. Again, usual caveats, your mileage may vary, and I have no doubt there are some great record stores in New York, in other boroughs, or maybe even in those boroughs which I've failed to identify. I've talked about the ones I wasn't able to visit already, and those are the limitations of a video like this. And again, remember that you visit a record store on a particular day, you may be there the day before a great new shipment comes in from a great collection and you're suddenly finding a lot of gold. You may find it's totally picked over. So visiting a record store on one day is never as reliable as going there every month to see what's there. It's never going to tell you as much about how good of a store it is. I was obviously only able to go to each of those stores on a particular day for a snapshot on that day. Anyway, you guys know all these things, but I do have to say them. And all that said, I hope I got within a standard deviation of the truth about shopping for used jazz records in New York. I hope this is helpful to you in your digging. Thank you very much for watching. I look forward to your comments, of course, and I look forward to seeing you next time.